Hello everyone, welcome to Gallery Teachers. I'm Gabriel and my workshop is about how you can use simple images in your classroom to give your students more aha moments. I love using images in my classroom. Images to help students understand grammatical concepts. Images to help students remember vocabulary, and images for, I really don't remember what this was for. Yeah, images. But before we start, this workshop is about drawing, and during the workshops, I'm going to give you some tasks, either for you to try out after the workshop, or maybe even very, very quickly during the workshop. So if you want to try out what you're going to learn today, and I strongly recommend you do, you're going to want to take a note of some of the tasks and maybe even have some pen and paper in front of you for some drawing action at the end. Remember, practice makes perfect. But okay, let's get started. So what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to split this workshop into the long part and the short part. In the long part, we're going to talk about psychological theories in the 1970s and ducks and a learning technique that consistently proves itself to be awesome. In the short part, we're going to look at snowmen and fossil fuels and a stick man running away from a boulder just like in the Indiana Jones film. And most importantly, from all of this, you're going to end up with some tools that you can take away to your lessons immediately and hopefully provide aha moments for your students. This is my mission here today. Okay, so this workshop is going to be one of those workshops where you do a bunch of stuff at the beginning, which you end up doing again at the end, but hopefully much better. So we're going to look at a task very quickly. I want you to imagine yourself in your classroom. One of your students is having problems with one of these issues. If it's grammar, then they're having difficulty getting their head around the grammatical concept. If it's vocabulary or something more vocab-based, they're having trouble just remembering the word. And think about this question. What simple image would you produce to help your students understand these issues? Again, I'm going to go through these one by one, giving you a little time to think about them, but don't worry, we're going to look at these at the end. You don't have to have something solid, but can you think of an image for each of these issues? So what image would you use to help your students remember the word crane? The machine, not the animal. Okay. How would you help your students remember the word drown? With one simple image. Okay, what about the difference between a little and little? He's got a little money, he's got little money. One simple image. And ing versus ed adjectives, like boring versus bored, or exciting versus exciting. One simple image. And what if your students are having problems remembering the word pour, like to pour a drink? What simple image would you use for that? And what about the difference between a and the two main articles? And finally, the difference between little versus few. Okay, like I said, we're going to come back to these. Again, you don't have to have anything in mind. Just ideas have to start moving, and that's all that was for. If you have some images already, then great. But first, let's go back 10 years. Back in 2012, my partner and I moved to Istra in Russia. It was a quiet little town, one of those Moscow satellites where people working in the city moved to for a cheap house to bring up their family. The town pretty much consisted of pensioners, nuclear families, and a lot of bored teenagers. There wasn't much to do there at all, and I spent a lot of time just walking around taking photos of anything, really. My partner and I were the only first language English speakers in the whole town, and almost no one spoke English as a second language. Not that pensioners, nuclear families, and bored teenagers particularly wanted to speak to us. They had better things to do. But this didn't stop us from making a few serious attempts at learning some Russian, at least survival Russian. So, weeks before the move, we got a Teach Yourself Russian audio course, which we listened to religiously in the weeks leading up to the move to Russia. Natasha, our MP3 Russian teacher, who we'd always hear but never see, was the one who gave us our basic Russian skills. And there was something that Natasha really went to town with, something she did a lot, which I call memory hooks. I'll give you an example. Let's look at the word понimать, which is Russian for understand. She'd say something like, I want you to imagine a pony, and the pony is sitting on a mat. You have that now? Okay, and what's the pony saying? Yes, the pony is saying, I don't understand. Pony, mat, понимать. Right, weird, yeah? But it worked. This was the first and only time I needed the meaning of that particular word explained to me. I remember it still, and that was the first, ever since that first time. And this worked for all sorts of other words too. Завтрак, breakfast. She said she got us to imagine sitting in a truck having breakfast with a Tsar. Спешить, to rush, because humans are the only species to be in a rush all the time. Budu, I will or I'm going to. This one was quite simple. It was, Buddha is the future. Suitably simple, considering Buddha's in there. Почему, why? Well, you need this question, why, when your knowledge is patchy and there's a cow, moo. Okay, not perfect, but it worked. I still remember it. In fact, the moo cow bit helped me remember because it was ridiculous. The memory hooks are fun to create, but most importantly, these strong and weird images really, really stick. If you need to learn an unfamiliar alien word like почему or спешить, how many times are you going to need to be exposed to that word before you can remember it? Was that 5, 10, 15 times? These memory hooks really narrowed down most, not all, but most of the vocabulary to between just 1 and a few exposures before they were there, ready in my head, ready for recall. So how does this all work? Did Natasha invent this magic memory hooking thing? Turns out, this has been around for quite a long time, and there's lots of research on it. Much of the groundwork for modern ELT memory techniques harks back to the 1970s, a time not known for its restraint, academic or otherwise. Back then, the world of psychology was breaking off the shackles of behaviorism, and there were all sorts of weird experiments going on in the field of experimental psychology, including the notorious, fascinating, and rather conclusion-jumping split brain experiments, and Columbia University researchers who thought they could teach a monkey, who they disingenuously named Nim Chimpsky. They thought they could teach the monkey how to speak English using sign language. You develop a whole language. It's a monkey. It didn't work. But amidst all the madness, there was some sensible but nonetheless fascinating stuff going on as well, of course. In the early 70s, an experimental psychologist, Gordon Bauer at Stanford University, became fascinated with Alan Pavio's concept of dual coding. Now, time doesn't allow me to give dual coding its dues here, but in a nutshell, it posits that we have 2 types of cognition going on in our heads at the same time. One is verbal and language-based, and the other one is nonverbal and chiefly consists of images. These 2 strands are not completely independent, however. They work simultaneously, and the more we make use of both of them when we're coding information, the better our ability to recall that information later. That's how the theory goes. Bauer was particularly interested in the idea of imaging to tap into this nonverbal feature of our brain in order to enhance verbal knowledge, as opposed to just using verbal techniques. Bauer's experiments on these ideas in the early 70s brought up some fascinating results. In his most famous, his test subjects were presented with 100 different word pairs and had to memorize them. For example, dog bicycle, sun building, mirror lamp. 100 word pairs like this. Half of his respondents, the experimental group, they were asked to remember these word pairs by imagining the two things interacting with each other in one image. So, with a dog and a bicycle, quite easy, you imagine something like this. A dog riding a bicycle. A nice, strong image. The other half of the respondents were simply left to their own devices to learn the word pairs. The results were quite remarkable. They showed that the subjects using the mnemonic method, the memory technique, imagining the nouns interacting like the dog and the bicycle, they learned about 50% more of the vocabulary than the test group. Further experiments testing imaging versus freestyle learning or versus rote repetition yielded similar results, between 53 and 59% stronger recall using the visual memory technique. Okay, but how does this all relate to language learning? Well, in 1975, another Stanford professor, Richard Atkinson, decided to see how this technique could be applied to foreign language learning, devising something which he called the keyword method. Remember that phrase. We're going to hear it a lot today. I always imagine the keyword method as a kind of triangle. Let me explain. One corner of the triangle, you've got the L2 target word, the second language target word. So let's say you're learning Spanish and you need to remember the word for duck, which is pato. Now, you could try and just learn the word by staring at it for hours and hoping it seeps into your head. Not advised. You could also create an association with the Spanish word pato and the English translation duck. Pato, duck, pato, duck, pato, duck is a bit better. But let's add some imaging. We simply associate the Spanish word pato with the image of a duck, the reality of a duck. And this is much better. And this is starting to resemble, what most people do when they learn new vocabulary. But when you apply Bauer's idea of creating a vivid association, you create the third corner of the triangle. This is where all the magic happens. How do we do this? Well, you think of an L1 word, a first language word that resembles the target vocabulary. So pato sounds a bit like pot, especially if you have an American accent like Atkinson did. Pot, pato, pot. So imagine a duck running around like an idiot with a pot on its head. The more ridiculous and vivid the image, the better it is and the more likely you're going to remember it. Atkinson, he carried out a few experiments on this method. They were fairly similar to Bauer's and yielded similar impressive results. In one experiment where absolute beginners were given Russian words to memorize, he found that the respondents using the keyword method were able to recall about between 24 and 26% more than the control group, who weren't trained in the keyword method. In another experiment, this time with Spanish vocabulary, the keyword subjects could recall 88% of the vocabulary, while the control group, this time only asked to use rote repetition to remember the words, they only recalled 28%. So that's a 68% improvement. Juicy results, right? Well, there's more, much more. The keyword method was tested again and again and again over the next 4 decades, and the results were, on the whole, pretty solid. Most of the studies were overwhelmingly positive, though there were some that showed more ambiguous results, especially when it came to long-term retention. I wanted to get an overview of this, so I decided to measure all the experiments I could find on the keyword method, 20 in all, ranging from Atkinson's original 1975 experiments to a couple that were conducted just a couple of years ago. And I put them into categories that I gave very, very scientific names to. Category 1, keyword method sucks and totally doesn't work. Category 2, keyword method's okay and kind of works sometimes but not all the time, and it sort of depends on various factors, but it's okay. And category 3, Keyword Method is awesome. Okay, and the results? Totally solid. Out of the 20 studies performed on the Keyword Method over the years, 8 had mixed results. 12 yielded only positive results. Okay, how's your maths? Yep, you got it. None of them found solely negative results. It seems that visuals are really effective when it comes to learning new vocabulary. Anyway, back to Istra and our Russian learning. Soon enough, we were making up our own memory hooks outside Natasha's lessons. After discovering all the fascinating experiments, these fascinating experiments I just mentioned, I started to get a bit obsessed and introduced the keyword methods into my lesson a lot. And this obsession would continue after our time in Russia and into my lessons in Turkey, where we lived next. I would apply the keyword method in my classroom constantly. My rationale was that if this improves vocabulary acquisition as well as the experiments show that it does, then it's probably worth setting aside a whole session to train my students to use it, because it will save time in the future. We came up with keywords together, both in English and, interestingly, in Turkish too. Some of the best keywords I have actually come from my time during this period, and they all come from my students. Things like imagining Orlando Bloom as a flower to remember the word bloom. I mean, they have the word bloom already because of Orlando Bloom, so they're almost there. Just put Orlando Bloom in a flower. Genius. Things like imagining two people dancing the tango and getting in a right mess in order to remember the word tangle. And things like imagining an archaic witch doctor or a handsome prince, in this case, spitting into a patient's mouth in order to cure them, because the Turkish word for spit is to cure. It's absolutely disgusting. I'm really sorry that you can't unsee that, but it's a powerful image, and that's why it stuck with my students, and it's probably going to stick with you too now. So you're going to remember the word to cure now. I'm sure of it because of this image. It's disgusting, but that's the thing. Disgusting, vivid, ridiculous images. These are the ones that really, really stick. It's worth pointing out. Okay, let's take a look at a few more examples. I want you to have a look at these words. Okay, now, have you got any thoughts on what kind of keywords we can create for these? I'll show you what I've got in a minute, but first I just want to say that most of the following keywords, the ones I'm going to show you, they came from my students, not from me. And that is the best thing. If your students make a keyword themselves, then they are more likely to remember it. This is a cognitive process, right? And there's nothing more personal and private than one's own brain. So yeah, it's always best. I strongly recommend that don't feed them keywords yourself. Encourage them to come up with their own ones. Okay, so yeah, let's have a look at the keywords I've got for this. Okay, so bruise. Any thoughts? Any keywords come to mind? Well, bruise sounds a bit like Bruce, and you got Bruce Willis, and Bruce Willis is always covered in bruises in all of his films, right? Especially the Die Hard movies. Bruce Willis. Insist. This is one of my students, and she really liked it, and it really worked for her. Two sisters, one of them wants to go out, one of them wants to stay in. The one who wants to stay in always wins because she insists. She's the in sister. She's the in sister. It worked. It worked well for her. Range. A range of Range Rovers. Again, we have this word range already because the brand is famous. So just apply some meaning to it and the students are almost all the way there. With the image, they should be all the way there. Smother. Well, what does smother sound like? This is very Freudian. A mother smothers her child. The word smother has the word mother in it. Is that a coincidence? I think not. But yeah, there we go. Another image. A mother smothering her child. And finally, battle. This was quite an elaborate one, but it seemed to work. You go into a cave. Suddenly you see there are lots and lots of vampire bats everywhere. You're going to have to fight them because the bat will attack. The bat will attack. The bat will attack. Yeah, there we go. Strong images. Okay, cool. So that's the end of the first longer part of the workshop. Now for the second, shorter part. In the last part, we looked specifically at Atkinson's Keyword Method and how we can apply it to learning vocabulary and using that dual cognition-based approach to making actual images that we exploit with the power of association in the brain. All of that stuff, that's what we just covered. But sometimes the keyword method isn't always the best way. Some words just don't lend themselves to memory hooks. You can't think of anything. Sometimes some words just don't have it. And sometimes we also just want to express more complicated, more grammatical concepts that involve relationships and processes and moving parts and dynamic stuff. And again, keyword method isn't great for that. So let's look at the whole idea of using images in a more general way. Images are powerful and are a great way of explaining things. We do, after all, at least according to Bauer, process images just as much as we do language. But when it comes to learning new vocabulary, some images are better than others, right? What makes a compelling image? That's my question. What is it that makes the students go, ah? What provides those aha moments? I thought about my own experience and how, over the years, I've got better at using images to introduce new vocabulary. It's just something, as a teacher, you get better at, part of your craft. One example that always springs to mind is how I used to and how I now teach the word coal. Coal, that stuff you put in a fire if you live in the Industrial Revolution. I found very quickly that just drawing a picture of some coal doesn't help. I mean, what's that? It could be anything, right? When I put it up on the whiteboard, I was just met with lots of confused faces. Okay, so something's missing. How can we provide clarity for this? Well, context. Context helps provide clarity. Okay, so let's go for all the context. Let's show the students how coal is made. Let's illustrate that complicated, muddled procedure of the fossil fuel process. Dinosaurs and plants die, and then we wait, and then the earth squashes them, and then coal. This is coal. That's got all the context, right? But more confused faces. So what's the problem here? Well, it's too complicated. It doesn't have impact. You don't get the sound that teachers live for, that With this, it's more like, yeah, maybe I know what you mean. Maybe. So we need something that has context and impact. Something simple that everyone can relate to. Boom. Okay, the difference here? Well, impact. The thing has to have impact. The image has to have impact. This has impact because it's a simple drawing. You can see what it is immediately. It also has impact because, context permitting, it triggers something in the students. It has strong emotional connotations. Okay, granted, this probably doesn't work everywhere. If you're teaching in Malaysia or Panama or Dubai, this image might not do the trick. When teaching, you always have to remember your students' context. That's really, really important. If you see something in a book they won't relate to, probably not a good idea to use it. But if you find something that they do that is relatable for them, use it. It's what's part of being a good teacher. But yeah, what makes a compelling image? Well, maybe like the snowman, it reminds us of Christmas and childhood and cancelled school days. Maybe it's just funny. Or maybe it's absolutely bizarre. What is it that makes a good image? I've asked that question 5 times now. What's the answer? Well, here it is. Here's what I think. I think it's the combination of clarity. We need to see what it is. And impact. It needs to be simple and effective. Okay, now I'm going to give you a task to do at home in a little bit. But before we get to that, let's remind ourselves of the theories, techniques, and ideas from the workshop. The main thing, the headline, I guess, is that the brain likes to cheat. We can use memory techniques and strategies to make learning quicker. They're not impressive memory feats. They're just shortcuts. They're just hacks. But they work. What kind of memory techniques and hacks do we have? Well, we've got the keyword method. Using dual coding and Atkinson Siri, we can give our students keywords to make these shortcuts. When using images more generally, you've got that magic combination of impact and clarity. Okay, so now it's that bit of the workshop where we think about the stuff we did at the beginning, but at the end, and hopefully better than we did at the beginning. The past is back to haunt us. So remember these language features, the ones we looked at the beginning of the workshop. We've done lots of small tasks now, and it's kind of time to bring them together and work on our main task. And that is taking these language features and creating the best, the most awesome, the most cognitively effective and most impactful images that we can. So hopefully you've given a little thought to these language features. Right now, I want you to just choose one, and think about a strong image to express this language feature to help our students understand. Right, I'm going to give you a minute to think about it. I'm disappearing for a minute. I'll see you in a minute. Look at these. One image. Just choose one. Good luck. Okay, good. Hopefully you have something. If you have more than one, even better. Good for you. Now, I'm going to show you the ones I've come up with, but remember, this isn't the right way to do things. This is just what I came up with. Remember, this is all very personal. What works for some people may not work for others, and you need to kind of work your way through that with your students. But again, I'm going to give you my examples just so we have more examples, and from examples, we can get more ideas. Okay, so a crane. Okay, well, a crane in Ukraine. Ukraine has the word crane in it. Again, we're exploiting stuff the students already know. Just give them a little image and it pushes them to hopefully remember that word forever. Drown. Well, which direction do you go when you drown? It's down, right? So drown, down, one letter out. It's a bit dark. It's a bit morbid, but again, vivid images, disgusting images, ridiculous images, dark stuff. Like this sticks to us much more. Okay, what about a little versus little? This one's interesting, I think, because it's not about quantity. It's about your attitude towards the quantity. A little cash for some person is little cash for another person. So it's all about how they feel. I got a little cash, I feel fine. I got little cash, I don't feel fine. I've got very little cash, I'm desperate. Okay, ing versus ed adjectives, boring, bored, exciting, excited. This is all about a direction, right? Like something starts somewhere and ends up somewhere. Like if the book is boring, it creates the boredom and that boredom ends up in your head. So if you can sort of show that process, it could really help the student. Okay, poor. Okay, imagine going to like a lavish, expensive party full of billionaires, and wherever you go, someone's there to top up your drink. And who's that person? Well, compared to everyone else, that's a poor person. The poor person is pouring your drinks. The poor. Social inequality as a way of remembering vocab. This one's maybe my favorite, articles, because language is interesting, right? what is language? One thing about language is that when the words we use when we're communicating with someone, we choose those words on almost a subconscious level based on what we think the other person knows. It's all about relationships. Language is relationships, and our relationship with the person we're speaking to our audience, and what we think they know. And nothing illustrates this more than articles. It's the core of this concept. And that's it. Yeah. This is the meta-analysis of how articles work. It's quite simple in a very broad way. Does the other person know what you're talking about? Then it's the. If not, it's a. There are always exceptions, but this can really help the students with this tricky concept that is problematic all the way up until advanced. So yeah, this has helped a lot of my students. Finally, little versus few. Sometimes it's good if you have a good relationship with your students to highlight the mistakes they make and why the mistakes they make are funny. So sometimes students say funny things unintentionally. And if you have a good rapport, you can point this out to them. What you really said was this. I had a student who said he went to a wedding and there were lots of men and very little women. And I showed him this, I drew this picture for him and showed him what he actually said. And he thought that was pretty funny. And now he doesn't make that mistake anymore. Little and few. Right, before we go to questions, there are a few things I just want to conclude with. Research. Research is important, but I think we should never underestimate the power of teachers' instinct too. How many SLA studies, second language acquisition studies, have been conducted? Meticulous, careful, and scientific studies and meta-studies with strong conclusions and fascinating insights, only for most teachers to look at them and say, we were already doing that, we knew that. A lot of the time it feels like the academic world confirms things that the teachers were already doing already. And that's fine, don't get me wrong, I'm an academic myself and it's so important for our field. It informs our field. Teachers know what the studies show a lot of the times, but sometimes studies do show where we've been going wrong too. However, but yes, a lot of the time it feels like the academic world is confirming what we kind of already were doing. However, some of these images may not work for your classroom, even though they have been academically shown to be pretty useful. No one knows your students better than you do. Some of your students may have a different approach to self-study, and often this does need to be respected. Some of these differences are kind of based on cultural things, personal things, relationships within the classroom dynamic. They all have to be respected. But having said that, I think we can say that most of our students respond well to images most of the time. Remember the principle of dual cognition. Engage the imaginary senses and the verbal senses at the same time. And if you decide to do that with images, next time you've got your board marker, you're reaching for the board to illustrate some sort of grammatical point or help a student remember a word, remember that magic combination. Keep it in mind, that magic combination of clarity plus impact equals aha moment. Now, I know that some of you are working with monolingual classes and some of you are working with multilingual ones, and you might be wondering whether it makes a big difference to using the keyword method. And that's a good question. Although there are some obvious differences between multilingual and monolingual classes in terms of how you can apply the keyword method, I think that the fundamental principles will still be the same. Remember, your goal isn't necessarily to merely feed keywords to your students, but to show them how it works so that they can use them themselves. Now, as I mentioned in the workshop, Some of the keywords that my students have come up with consisted of using English words and phrases to remember other English words and phrases, while others drew on their L1 knowledge, their first language knowledge, to remember English words and phrases. So, like using a Turkish phrase to remember an English word, for example. The important thing is that our students exploit the keyword method in whichever way works best for them. So, if your class is monolingual and you speak the same language as your class, it might even be a good idea, at the beginning at least, to try using that L1, that first language, to create the keywords together. I think there are a couple of good reasons for this. First of all, it's easier. And when things are easier, being human beings, we like doing it more. So this could actually be a good opportunity to encourage your students to get used to coming up with keywords before they start trying English to English ones. And of course, this is even more appropriate for lower levels, as you know, they're going to have much more limited vocabulary. So it's quite challenging to think of a English to English keyword. Even if your class is multilingual, you can still encourage them to use their first language. You may remember during my presentation, I show you that I used some Russian ones or some Spanish ones or some Turkish ones. And even if you didn't understand those languages, you still understood what was going on, right? And so should your students. Not many people in this world won't get that. It's not too difficult a concept. So you could show them some keywords that you created for your own language learning. Even if they don't know the languages involved, they'll still be able to understand the principle and hopefully start making some themselves. It's the idea that's important, not the content, really. But again, and this is the most important point, it doesn't really matter whether they use L1 to English, first language to English, or English to English keywords. What matters most is whatever they're doing is working for them. The goal is to remember vocabulary. It doesn't matter how they do it, which one works best for them. So yes, in short, the way you do it and the way you approach the keyword method will probably be affected by whether you have a monolingual class or a multilingual class. But at the end of the day, you're giving them a tool, and the tool is the same tool, whether they're using their first language or whether they're just using English.